Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. A few videos back you may have seen that I bought a whole collection of 1/24th scale glue bomb hot rods from eBay, and in amongst that collection was this car, the one that really caught my eye. Now my intention with the whole collection is to turn them all into slot cars. Some will be used as donor parts to make castings from, some will be used exactly as they turned up to me, others will be taken apart so I can cast the wheels and tyres and so on to make a whole range of other slot cars that can be recreated in resin castings and then mashed all back up together again to make some really nice custom cars. Anyway, in amongst all that lot was this car, as I said. This is my absolute favourite car of the whole collection, and I really want to get this one done first. Now, to honour the original builder of this car, because he's done such a beautiful job on modelling it, I don't want to do hardly anything to it, only turn it into a slot car itself. So to that end, I'm going to be keeping all of the chassis and all of the body. There won't be any parts from this used as masters for other cars other than the wheels and tyres. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get you on the bench, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm dealing with, and then we'll get on to trying to turn it into a slot car. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the car that we're dealing with. Like I say, this was the car that I saw when the eBay listing came up that really caught my eye, that really pushed me to buy the whole collection. All the other cars are pretty epic as well, but this one really jumped out at me, not least of which because of that awesome bulkhead. The original builder that did this car did a really nice job on it. I'm really very impressed. And all that wood grain on the bottom of the car there, that's all done by hand. I'm sure it is. I've looked at it closely with my 20 times loop, and I'm sure all that wood grain has been put in by hand. Just because of the way that the grain starts and stops at the end of each panel, it does look like it was probably done by hand. So the original builder put a lot of care into getting this car looking nice, and I don't want to damage any of his original work. So in respect for his work, I'm not going to take off hardly anything of this car, very minimal amounts, to try and maintain all of the original work that the original builder put into it. So to that end, I'm going to try and make a sidewinder arrangement and put the motor in across there so that the motor sits up inside this space here. I'm not going to pull the interior out. There is a full interior in there, all beautifully painted and weathered, and it looks amazing, but you can't really see it. But if you put a light in there, you can see it if you squint. But I don't want to take apart any of this car to get to the interior just for the sake of a driver. I don't think it's going to bring much to the party, and it will be a shame if I end up damaging any part of it just for trying to get a driver in there that you couldn't see. So I'm going to leave all of this in place. The chassis rails, they'll all stay in place as well. The only thing I'm actually going to take off and replace to metal is the bar that runs across here to support the wheels. That's going to have to go into brass from side to side for strength. So I'll remake that, but I'll make it as close as I can to the original kit, paint it and weather it to the approximate paint that's already here now. So trying to keep it as original as possible. So when it's turned into a slot car, the only thing you're really going to see that'll be reasonably obvious is the guide. Everything else will come across as being this original car. I even might try and keep these wheels if I can, I'm not sure, but these wheels and tyres will be turned into resin castings so that they can be used as a slot car, and then once I've taken castings of these wheels and tyres, I can use those wheels and tyres on other projects coming along, and also I can offer them to you guys on my web shop if you want to buy a set of wheels and tyres for a 1/24th scale hot rod as well. The other wheels and tyres from the other kits will be turned into products as well to sell, but this is going to be the first one. This body will not be turned into a resin. This body is going to stay as an original. The other kits that I bought, they will be sort of donated for masters for other bodies, but not this one. This one's staying as it is in its original colours, looking exactly as you see it now. So the parts that I've got to go in this car is a 38 tooth slotted sidewinder gear, a standard slotting plus guide, a 20k pendle slot long can motor, and a 9 tooth brass slotted pinion gear, And between the pinion and the main gear, we're looking at 4.2 to 1. Now, this is quite a heavy car. It's got quite a lot of weight up top. It's only going to have the strength of its chassis. So I don't actually know how high a performance this car is going to be. But this car isn't going to be about absolute performance. It's just going to be a really nice 1/24th scale hot rod cruiser that will have hopefully a reasonable amount of torque. So with a 20k motor geared at 4.2 to 1, that's going to generate a decent amount of power. It should hopefully be quite smooth power with the Pendle slot motor. I don't think these motors are particularly spiky. I think they're very nice and smooth. So that should give me a nice amount of power to get this car to go around the track at a reasonable speed. I don't expect it to be a rocket ship, but I don't expect it to be slow. And I hope that the original chassis that I'm going to leave in place is going to be man enough to keep this car under control at a reasonable, interesting speed. So let's get on my workbench and start making the rear pod to get this motor up into the body and start our journey with turning it into a slot car. Okay, so let's start by getting the chassis free of the body, and I'll take off the fuel tank and see where we go from there. Well, that was remarkably easy. Didn't expect it to come off that easy. Great, well that's a really good start. Now we can deal with what we've got. Right, so I've had a good old poke and prod around, and I was hoping to try and get this motor up inside the body and fix the motor to the back side of the interior, because the interior is very well fixed in. But I think, to be honest, because it's difficult to get the angle in there, there's plenty of room to put the motor wherever I want to put it. And although I'm going to use a 3mm axle, this is a 2.4mm drill, I can actually get plenty of clearance on this axle anywhere on that flat area. And if I was to machine the middle of my axle down for a little bit of clearance, I could actually get it to clear the motor as well, even on the side. But I think I'd rather get it on the side like that, so I can bring the motor as far forward as I can possibly bring it, because obviously the centre of gravity is going to be quite high. But I'm looking at this chassis now, and I'm wondering whether it might be easier to work from the chassis and mount the motor into the chassis, sinking it right down into the chassis bed, and get the motor. And this axle here is roughly comparable to the diameter of this brass tube, so I could probably use the brass tube as an outside diameter for the tube, it's for the axle tube, and then bring this motor down to it with the axle mounted in this tube as an axle thus. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to chop out a piece of this plastic here and work off the chassis rather than working down from the body. Also, working from the chassis means that I can clear those chassis rails quite comfortably. So the next job is to take out these beams, pop out the back axle. I've already made my marks where the back axle has got to come on the body, and the wheel spacing is as close to the body as you can get, so I know roughly what that is, nothing special there. So that's what I'll do. I'll get this back axle off and try and work out a way of making up some sort of pod to hold the motor on via the inner chassis. Okay, so having cut away this piece of plastic, it's looking very likely that I could fit a brass plate coming off the inside of the chassis rail holding this end of the motor and a brass chassis plate coming off the inside of this chassis rail, holding this end of the motor, and either end having bearings. So I might actually be able to, rather than making a cradle to hold the motor and put the cradle into the chassis, it looks like I'll be able to make brackets on the chassis to hold the motor and the axle directly, which kind of makes life a little bit easier maybe. So let's investigate that avenue. Okay, so after some faffing about, there is the motor pod. So the way this will work is the motor will go up against the inside of that bulkhead with some holes obviously to allow it to drop. Obviously holes drilled in the end here to allow that pinion to come through, and there'll be a secondary bulkhead coming across the motor face here into this section here and then soldered into place so the motor's got something to bolt to. I will then drill 2 holes in here and in here, make up some bearings, put the bearings in so the axle can go through, and then that will allow us to mount the gear in there, and then the motor will obviously sit into there. And then once that's all done, these holes can be countersunk on the inside and in here, and then the rivets can be cut to length and pinned over, and this brass motor mount can then be glued all into place as well as riveted, so that'll be nice and strong. So let's get on with marking out these holes and getting some bearings made. And there we are, 2 little shouldered bearings to take a standard 2.38mm axle or 3/32 axle, no problems at all. So the next job is to mark out my centre line accurately on both sides of the chassis, and then drill a hole to the same diameter as the inner part of this bearing, and then file away the top shoulder of this bearing so that it fits right up into that frame, because I want the bearing to be in the same space as the frame to get the bearing right up high, because the original axle was only about 4mm, and that's what I'm trying to simulate on here. You see there, the axle is roughly the same diameter as that, so I'm trying to match the original size. So there we are. So today I bought a new tool. Now I've never tried these before. These are diamond files, and if you guys, let's open them up, hang on. And if you guys have actually tried diamond files before, now these are a dirt cheap set, they really were, but it's £6.30, so they were ridiculously cheap, probably far too cheap to get a decent idea of what they're actually like. But if you guys have used diamond files before, let me know, because I'd like to know. I want to try these now and we'll see how we go with them. But if you've had really good experiences with them or bad, let me know, because if these are good, or they could be good, I might invest in a really nice quality set of diamond files. because I think they might be really useful for filing in brass. So let's get these bearings adjusted, get the holes put in, get the bearings soldered in, we can finally get our back axle into place. So there we are, that gets the back end finished with regards to the bearings, and as you can see, very free to turn, no problems at all. So the next job is to drill a couple of holes in the end of this bulkhead here so that the motor can clear. Drill a hole in this bulkhead here so that the pinion can come through, because I don't want to chop too much of this pinion off, and then make a motor plate which runs across the front of the motor into this section here with 2 adjustable bolts, so the motor is able to be moved up and down to adjust for the mesh of the gear. So let's make this motor mount and get it bolted into the pod, and then I can finally then button up all these rivets and get the motor pod finally fixed into place and get this back end driven. So that gets us the motor fitted into the pod with a little bit of clearance for the pinion through this outer bulkhead and engaging nicely into that gear, and the motor is sitting nicely in this end, all insulated from the brass but snugly fitting on that end bell of the motor. So that is basically self-supporting, and I've just got a nice bit of backlash there with a parallel gap and a parallel gap. So now is to make that bulkhead to go into here, and we can get it bolted in and then dress the rest of it up and get it into the chassis. So that's the motor pod more or less finished. So the way it works is the motor threads into the front and then reverses up into that mount there. That's nice and solid. And then this plate here slides down into here. There's a bolt, this one here, goes in there to lock the plate up tight. These two short M2 bolts, nuts, screws, go in there into the motor, and you can access those through these holes here. Do them up, and then your axle goes in. This little spacer goes on there, but it's a bit tricky to set it up right now. And then the gear would go in there, and your axle stop goes in there, and that whole thing goes through, and it all assembles up. That bolts in the way like that, and there it is. That's the whole motor pod all assembled. So the next job now is to get it all riveted and glued into the chassis, and I can get everything fine-tuned and show you it all running perfectly. There you go, that's it. Pods all riveted in, glued into place, motor in, bearings in, axles in, all the backlash done, everything's working properly, and with a very small amount of backlash on those gears that you should be able to see, perfect. And if we put power to the motor, we get movement. No problems whatsoever. So the next job to do is to get all of these parts in, and I want to try and maintain the originality of the car. So I've got to put some sort of brace across the back here so that the fuel tank can go back in. So there's going to be a little bit of a modelling challenge there. I also want to do something with this back axle so the back axle sits back over the axle there. I think I'm going to be chopping off some of this axle and then grinding a slot in the top and a groove in the middle and putting some sort of bearing in the middle or something so that that axle can go back in the middle, and the diff as well. And then I want to make up some end pieces so that the end pieces go into the diff and then locate this end into the engine, so you end up with all the original parts back in the car like that somehow. So let's see if I can get my head around getting these other parts back over all this. after much gnashing of teeth, this is the concoction that I've come up with. It all needs painting obviously and sorting out, but this is now one complete piece. So the drive shaft, the UJs, the differential and the fuel tank all completely together, and there's actually a brass bush right inside of the middle of the differential. So the way that it goes is this little brass pin locates into the engine, to the back of the engine there, the gearbox, and snugs up, and the axle fits in, runs through the bearing and out the other side there, and the actual axle holds the whole center assembly in place. Now when the end stopper goes in and the gear goes in, that will create two little gaps here and here, and I intend to make two little brass loops that fit inside there. It limits that movement, but it also holds these two rods which need to go in like this. They'll sit in just like that, and then obviously you'll have the gears in there and the end stopper in there, and all will be good. So that's what I need to do now. Two little tiny brass collars on there. Get these rods soldered onto the brass collars. These rods may end up having to be changed for brass. I don't know how well this rod will solder to it. Once that's done, this whole back end can be painted up and finished. And there we are. I think that might be the end of part one of turning this kit into a slot car. All went together rather nicely, kept all the attributes of the kit itself, whilst actually powering up the back end. And that's how it all looks when it's done. So I don't think that I've destroyed the inside of this car too much. I think all the original components are back in to a reasonable, acceptable level. I don't think we've lost too much in the detail. There's a very small amount of end float in that back axle, the perfect amount, and you hardly see the gear from the back at all. I was tempted to paint this green slotted gear, but I think, to be honest with you, once a wheel is over it and the back end, you can barely see it, so I think I'm going to leave it. So I'm quite happy with it. So if we get some power to it, you can hear it run. So I think that'll do us for part one, and in part two I'll strip out this front end, make this beam across here out of brass, and we'll find some way of getting a slotting plus guide on there and find a home for these pickup wires. So if you've enjoyed this content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you hit the little bell button, that'll be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.